Today, we're tackling a sore stack about a really defining moment, certainly in recent UK history, the 2016 vote to leave the European Union, Brexit.
Yeah, and it's just one of those topics, isn't it? It cuts across everything, economics, culture, identity. So our mission today is, well, we're testing what we're calling the Brexit
Right,
hypothesis.
the Brexit hypothesis. And what we mean by that, essentially, is this. Did people know what they were voting for? Specifically, did the UK electorate consciously decide, okay, we'll accept getting poorer economically speaking?
In exchange for getting back, national identity, sovereignty, the whole take back control idea. Was it a deliberate trade-off?
Exactly. Rational choice versus maybe something more emotional or identity driven.
That's the core question. So to figure this out, we need to break it down. First, what economic information did voters actually get back in 2016?
Okay.
Second, who were the Leave voters?
Yeah.
What drove them? We need to dissect that vote.
The anatomy of the vote, yeah.
And finally, what's actually happened since 2016? What does the economic ledger look like now? Quantify the reality.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's start with part one, the economic picture painted back then.
Yeah.
On the Remain side, you had this huge institutional consensus, didn't you? Almost everyone warning about economic damage.
Oh, absolutely. The consensus was, frankly, overwhelming. You had the UK's own treasury leading the charge. Their big analysis basically said, look, Britain will be permanently poorer outside the EU, structurally poorer.
And they put a figure on it, too. I remember that. What was it, about 6.2% lower GDP by 2030?
That was their central estimate, yeah. And they translated that, trying to make it real for people, into about £4,300 per household per year. That's a pretty stark warning.
A huge number. And the reasoning behind it wasn't particularly radical, was it? Just standard economics?
Pretty much textbook stuff. You raise trade barriers with your biggest trading partner, which the EU was by far. Then, trade goes down, investment gets hit because of uncertainty, and eventually productivity suffers. It's cause and effect.
So if the long-term warnings were based on these kind of established principles, why did they get labeled Project Fear and arguably dismissed by so many?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting politically. The Treasury didn't just warn about long-term slow burn damage. They also predicted a big, immediate economic shock, a recession, right after the vote.
Which didn't happen. Not straight away, anyway.
Exactly. The economy definitely took a hit, confidence wobbled, the pound fell, but we didn't plunge into immediate recession.
Yeah.
And that single forecasting miss, that short-term prediction being wrong,
That got seized upon.
completely weaponized. The Leave campaign brilliantly used it to say, see, the experts were wrong about the recession, so you can't trust anything they say. It discredited the whole package, including the completely separate, more robust long-term structural warnings.
Right. So the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, they later adopted this assumption of like a 4% long-term productivity hit from Brexit. That's a structural thing, totally different from predicting market panic tomorrow.
Totally different methodologies. But politically, that nuance was lost. Once the narrative "the experts are wrong" took hold, it was really hard for complex economic arguments to cut through.
And that created the space for the Leave campaign's economic vision, the global Britain idea.
Yeah, they needed some positive economic story. It mainly came from a small group, economists for Brexit, particularly Professor Patrick Minford.
Ah, yes, Minford's model. That was the outlier, wasn't it? The one predicting an upside.
The only really prominent one, yeah. It suggested, theoretically, a 4% increase in UK welfare, a net gain. But, and this is a huge but that often got lost,
Go on. Our sources flagged something pretty major here.
to get that 4% gain, Minford's model required the UK to immediately adopt unilateral free trade, just drop all import tariffs globally, full-on free market shock therapy.
Okay. And the consequence of that.
Well, Minford himself acknowledged in his modeling that this approach, this flood of zero tariff competition, would lead to and this is the quote, effective elimination of manufacturing in the UK.
Wait, hang on. The optimistic case for Brexit required wiping out UK manufacturing, including in the very areas, those post-industrial towns, that often voted Leave most heavily.
That's the paradox. The economic model promising gains was built on sacrificing precisely those communities. It's quite something.
That's more than a trade-off. That sounds brutal.
But obviously that wasn't the headline message.
No, the headline message was much simpler, much more direct. The bus, the $350 million a week for the NHS.
Exactly. Simple, tangible, emotional. Money for a beloved institution. Never mind that the UK Statistics Authority called the figure misleading almost immediately because it didn't account for the rebate or money already spent here.
Didn't matter.
Politically, it seems not. It cut through. So the takeaway from part one really is The economic debate wasn't necessarily won on the merits or the data. It was won by the better story. A tangible promise beat a complex warning.
Which logically leads us to part two then. If it wasn't primarily about economics, what was driving the leave vote? The anatomy of that decision.
Right. And that slogan, "Take Back Control," seems absolutely central. It brilliantly connected the idea of national sovereignty, decisions being made in
With
Brussels,
immigration.
inextricably linked. The academic work is really clear on this. Something like 73% of people who said they were worried about immigration voted leave. You have to remember the context that the 2015 European migrant crisis was all over the news.
So, who was the typical leave voter, according to the data? What did the British election study find?
It painted a really clear demographic picture. The strongest predictor by far was education level. Leave support was about 30 percentage points higher among people with GCSEs or equivalent compared to university graduates.
Wow, 30 points. That's a huge gap.
Massive. And you also saw clear splits by age older voters much more likely to vote leave. And geography, too. Support was concentrated in those post-industrial areas, coastal towns, places often described as feeling left behind by globalization.
And class. Did that play a role?
Definitely. Lower-income households under £20,000 a year and people in lower-skilled jobs were significantly more likely to vote leave. There's a clear link to economic precarity. These were groups who felt the system wasn't working for them.
Okay, so we have education, age, geography, class. But this is where our sources get into something deeper, don't they? Beyond demographics, into the psychology. The locus of control idea.
This finding is genuinely fascinating, maybe the real aha moment. Yeah. Psychologists talk about locus of control. Internal locus means you feel you're in charge of your own life. External locus means you feel your life is shaped by outside forces. You can't control fate, luck, powerful elites, global trends.
And the link to the Brexit vote.
A really strong correlation. People with a high external locus of control were significantly more likely to vote leave. It suggests the vote wasn't just about policy. It was an expression of feeling powerless.
So the slogan, "Take Back Control," it wasn't just about Parliament versus Brussels for these voters. It was more personal. Like, I need to take back control of my life.
That's exactly the interpretation. It tapped into this profound sense, especially perhaps in some working-class communities, of being buffeted by forces beyond their influence: globalization, deindustrialization, political elites who didn't seem to listen, cultural changes. The slogan offered a sense of agency.
It validated that feeling of powerlessness. That changes everything, doesn't it? It wasn't a spreadsheet exercise. It was an emotional response.
Very much so. And tied into that is the nostalgia factor. The studies also found a strong link between voting leave and agreeing with the statement, things in Britain were better in the past.
Right, a desire to restore something lost rather than build something new.
It points that way. Less about a calculated future gain, more about expressing dissatisfaction with the present and maybe reclaiming a perceived golden age, a non-economic expressive act.
So wrapping up part two, it looks like the motivation wasn't really that cool-headed economic calculation we talked about in the hypothesis. It was more about identity, defiance, culture, and this deep psychological need for control.
Yeah, the conscious and calculated choice part of our hypothesis seems pretty shaky based on this. The drivers were much more complex, much more emotional.
Okay. Which brings us to part three. Regardless of why people voted, what actually happened? Did the economic predictions, the getting poorer part of the hypothesis, come true? Let's look at the economic reality since 2016.
Well, the short answer is yes, largely. The OBR, the official fiscal watchdog we mentioned earlier, they've consistently stuck to their assessment. They estimate Brexit will reduce the UK's long-run potential GDP by about 4% compared to if we'd stayed in the EU.
And that's not just a forecast anymore, is it? That's based on observed data now.
Exactly. Based on how trade and investment have actually performed. It's become their working assumption about the structural reality.
And this has a real cost, right? Our sources mentioned a specific fiscal price tag: taxes.
Yeah, one analysis calculated that out of about $100 billion in tax rises brought in by the Parliament between 2019 and 2024, a very significant chunk, $40 billion, was needed specifically because of the economic damage, the hit to growth and revenues caused by Brexit.
40 billion pounds. That's a concrete number hitting taxpayers directly because the economy grew less than expected.
It's a direct fiscal consequence.
But how can we be sure it is Brexit? There was COVID, the war in Ukraine, global inflation. How do you isolate the Brexit effect?
That's the key challenge for economists. They use sophisticated methods, like the synthetic control method. You could call it the doppelganger test.
Okay, how does that work?
Basically, they create a synthetic UK, a weighted average of very similar economies like Canada, the US, Germany, France economies that didn't leave the EU. This synthetic UK acts as the counterfactual, what the UK economy might have looked like if it hadn't left.
So you compare the real UK to its economic twin that stayed in.
Exactly. And the results are pretty stark. By mid-2022, the analysis showed the real UK's GDP was around 5% lower than its synthetic twin. That 5% gap represents the estimated impact of Brexit, separated from other global shocks.
5% lower GDP, that's a huge divergence. Where did the impact hit hardest? What channels?
Two main areas stand out: investment and goods trade. Business investment basically flatlined between the referendum in 2016 and around 2022, just stalled. The uncertainty seems to have really deterred firms from committing capital. The estimated shortfall is maybe 10% compared to where it might have been.
And goods trade. That was always predicted to be hit by new barriers.
And it was. All the new non-tariff barriers, the customs checks, the rules of origin paperwork, the border friction, they've clearly had an impact. By late 2023, UK goods trade volumes were still about 10% below where they were in 2019, before COVID fully hit.
And how did that compare internationally?
That's the crucial bit. Over the same period, the rest of the G7 economies, on average, saw their goods trade volumes recover and grow to be about 5% above 2019 levels.
So a 15-point gap in performance. UK down 10%, rest of G7 up 5%. That's significant.
It really is. It shows the UK diverging negatively on goods trade.
But we should be fair, it's not all negative, is it? The services sector, where the UK is traditionally very strong.
That's shown a remarkable resilience, absolutely. It's a key part of the picture. Because the main trade deal, the TCA, focused much more heavily on goods than services, the immediate impact of new barriers was less severe for many service industries.
So services have held up better.
In fact, UK services exports have shown some of the strongest growth in the G7 since the pandemic. It's definitely a relative bright spot, though probably not enough on its own to offset the hits elsewhere, particularly to trade and investment.
And what about foreign direct investment, FDI, bringing new money and projects into the UK?
The picture there is, well, concerning. Overall project numbers haven't recovered to their pre-Brexit peaks around 2017. And worryingly, in a key future sector like tech, there was a reported sharp fall, something like 37% in FDI projects in 2024. The signals for long-term investment confidence are still looking pretty weak.
Okay, so let's pull all this together. Back to our original Brexit hypothesis.
Right. The hypothesis had two parts. Part one, accepting economic cost getting poorer. Part two, for the benefit of sovereignty and identity taking back control.
So on the economic cost part?
The evidence suggests that largely materialized. The long-term warnings from bodies like the Treasury and OBR, based on standard economics, seem to have been broadly accurate. There's a measurable negative impact on GDP, trade, and investment, leading to real fiscal costs like higher taxes. The getting poorer component seems to hold true relative to the counterfactual.
But the second part of the hypothesis, that this was a conscious, calculated trade-off made by voters.
That seems much less likely, based on everything we've seen about the drivers of the vote. It wasn't really an economic calculation for many. It seems to have been driven much more by non-economic factors, identity, immigration concerns, a sense of being left behind, and that powerful psychological desire to regain a sense of control over forces perceived as external and overwhelming.
So less a cool-headed decision, more an expressive act.
Exactly. An act of defiance, perhaps. A vote driven by emotion, identity, and psychology far more than by economic forecasting.
Which leads us perfectly into our final provocative thought for you, the listener. We talked a lot about that psychological finding, the external locus of control, the feeling that powerful outside forces are governing your life.
And that this feeling was a major driver behind the desire to take back control. So here's the question to ponder. If the root motivation for such a massive political change was, in part, this deep psychological sense of individual powerlessness against global forces,
Can an act of national political independence, taking back control at the national level, ever truly resolve that personal, psychological feeling of being controlled by external events? Or does that feeling simply find new targets closer to home, maybe domestic politics, internal divisions, cultural issues, now that the external other of the EU is no longer the primary focus?
a question about whether political solutions can fix psychological grievances or if those feelings just adapt and persist. Something to think about.